Hi everyone, I'm really excited for you to be joining us today for World Mental Health Day for Thrive London's 2020 festival. I'm Sanah Ahsan, I'm a liberation and community psychologist. I'm a poet, and my most recent research has been in deconstructing whiteness in clinical psychology. I'm also super excited to be joined by Jumoké Fashola, who is an award-winning presenter, an award-winning broadcaster, a blues singer, and also an incredible actress who very recently graced the stage of Hackney Showroom for Zawe Ashton's play for all the women who thought they were mad, which I'm really excited to talk to you about later. So we're going to be covering lots and lots of different topics today, but really getting into the issues around race and mental health for World Mental Health Day today. Please do get involved on social media with the hashtags that will come up on the screen below. So if we could start today, how are you? How is your heart?
Oh, how's my heart?
Yeah.
What a wonderful question to be asked, first of all. My heart's great, thank you. Really delighted to be here to spend some time with you and with people in general, talking about issues that are really close to my heart and are really important in this day and age.
Yeah, oh, I'm really excited to have you here. I was really blessed to see you on stage before the world turned upside down. I was wondering if you could share with us today a little bit about what that experience was like for you, maybe share a little bit about the concept of the play and what the play was about, as well as your experience of playing the character Ruth. That would be amazing.
So Zawe Ashton's play For All the Women Who Thought They Were Mad was on at the Hackney Showroom and ran for several weeks, and I played the matriarch Ruth in that. And my daughter, who was played by the fantastic Mina Andela, was going through a whole series of trauma, mental trauma, trying to navigate spaces. And at the same time, she had the pull of her mother, i.e. me, telling her, you know, you need to believe, you need to be stronger, you need to be quote unquote perfect. It was one of those experiences that I think has really revolutionized who I am as an individual. It's funny when you're an actor, you put on a role and then you take off a role. Whereas this particular play, Zawe's play, was one that I read, I did a workshop in, first of all, and then I was invited to work over a couple of days, and then they cast it, and I still remember the moment in the casting room where there was Zawe, there was our director, Joe McInnes, and also a representative from Hackney Showroom, and we all sat there, and in the middle of doing the final monologue that I do, we all started to cry together. There was this moment of where are the tissues, etc. It's an extraordinary play. It's a play that is full of light, but also full of darkness, full of truth, and also very confronting. And Zawe, I always remember she says that she wrote it in a flurry. So she wrote it over a very quick period of time. And she said it just came out of her, but then it took about 11 years to get on stage. You know, she had to work it and rework it, but also waiting for what she considered to be the right people, the right cast. Through that process, we spent a lot of time talking about mental health and about what it means to be black in a sphere that maybe doesn't recognize all the diversity that comes with being black, about being female, about the challenges of working in predominantly white spaces, about the challenges of trying to be authentic, but at the same time not diving into the stereotypes of the black, strong female, etc. And it was a really interesting process. And during that time, we also had lots of conversations with psychologists and things. We did constellations, for instance, which were incredible about what does it mean, what are your interrelationships as characters, but also made us think about who we are as individuals. So it was extraordinary, I have to say. It's also quite a dark play. So when I say it was one of the plays that brought me the most joy, that might sound odd, but behind the scenes, as a team of people who worked together, it was delightful. We laughed a lot, we cried a lot, we were accepting of each other a lot. You know, if you were grouchy, that was fine. If you were feeling a bit low, that was fine. If you were feeling ecstatic, that was fine. It was just one of my favorite times to be as an actor.
Oh, thank you for sharing so much of that. It sounds like a really transformative experience.
It really was. It really was. And I think part of it was definitely Joe McInnes, who just extraordinary director, but also Zawe's commitment to it. And the love in the room is always something that I remember. And we got to meet her parents and, you know, her mother, who was just extraordinary.
She's incredible.
Who's incredible. You know, there was all of this going on. So it was really special.
Yeah, it sounds, I think for me, watching that play, I think what it really speaks to is the power in art as a medium to communicate such complex issues around trauma, mental health, that it allows a delivery of that in a very nuanced way that can really speak to and land in the heart. Yes. And then also the script is incredibly poetic as well.
It really is. I mean, she is a poet. And, and I mean, the speech that I do right at the end, even now as I think about it, I start to well up. It's just one of those most beautiful things. That it really encapsulates what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a black woman right now. And I actually found it really hard initially to not start crying every time I said it. And, you know, Joe was like, "No, you can't cry. You cannot cry. Do not cry. You've got to hold it together."
Yeah.
Because it was so powerful, and you know, every word meant something in that play, and I think that's what made it so magnificent.
Yeah, for sure. I think there were so many themes in that play that I would really like to pull out and speak to you about. Yeah. And I think one of them that was quite overt was in the issues around intergenerational trauma.
Yes.
And how that carries through, and how each of the characters through generations are carrying so much of their own pain. Yeah. And I think for, you know, communities of colour at the moment, how we negotiate intergenerational trauma, carrying some of the more painful ways of managing distress, but also what we can learn intergenerationally in terms of how we can heal from our ancestors. You know, there's lots of positive and opportunities to learn from, as well as things that maybe have created challenge.
Yes.
You know?
I mean, I think it's a really important point, because I think, you know, we're probably about 2 generations in of people who initially came in, you know, who may have come from the diaspora. So we're here in the UK, but, you know, my parents came here for quote unquote a better life, or whatever it might be. There may be another generation beyond that. So you know, we're talking about maybe 2 generations in that have lived through this. There needs to be a recognition of what that meant. What does it mean to leave what you know, to come to a space that doesn't accept you necessarily initially, whatever that might be, to then try and find yourself within that, to understand what that meant for my parents, for instance. There's something I've never I only recently have started to think about. What did it mean for my mother to leave everything she knew, to come to a land that she didn't necessarily speak the language that well, a land that was very cold, a land that maybe wasn't very accepting of her as an individual, that didn't really recognize who she was, to leave everything behind, to come here. In fact, I wrote a song about it recently, to leave everything behind, to come here. What was that like? And who do you tell that pain to? Who do you share that with? And you don't share it with your children. So your children grow up going, "Why are you so ratty?" or whatever it might be. Because they're not mature enough to understand that it's not just about the irritation of what that child might have done that day. It is a bigger irritation around, I'm here for whatever reason. And have nowhere to talk about it.
Yes.
You know.
And I think in that silence, that I think is somewhat learnt and also continually modelled, and people perpetuate, what gets acted out. And therefore then, what do the next generation have to carry through what is unspoken? And how can they then learn to speak their trauma if it's never been modelled?
Yes. I mean, I think that's so important. I think if you... well, I can't say most of us, but a lot of us grew up in homes where you don't talk about pain. You don't, you know, let's talk about the practical things. Are you know, have you got A's in your school reports? You know, are you doing well? Are you dressed well? Are you a doctor? Are you a lawyer? Are you, you know, all the things that you were expected to be. You know, you come along and I say, "Oh, I want to be an actress." My mother called a family meeting. you're letting the family down now.
Yeah.
What's going on? You need to be a doctor. You know, you need to be a lawyer. And you're like, no, I want to be an artist. Mama's like, nah, you know. And it's really interesting to kind of navigate that, to try and say, this is my identity, mother, father, whoever it might be. This is who I want to be. And alongside that, them saying, no, but we are here because we wanted you to have a better life. You know, so what do you do with that? Yeah. Do you just go, oh, all right, I'll do what you want me to do because it works for you? Or do you stand your ground? And in standing your ground, what does that mean for you and the relationship you have with them? And not being able to say, these are the reasons why, you know, again, being silenced in a way. I think that is, I think a lot of us have lived with that and had to deal with that.
Yeah, I think that really lands for me. You know, I think it's something that definitely speaks to me too, and just negotiating, I think, that potentially that rejection or anger or rage from family when you are trying to affirm your identity and take ownership for who you are, but then at the same time negotiating spaces potentially that are predominantly white and also seeking acceptance and being met with rejection in different ways, you know, and then negotiating those two different things at the same time. How can you create a sense of self that is accepting, that is loving? And then I think bringing in as well, if that's never been modelled to you, if that acceptance has never been modelled in the home and you're not getting that in any relationships outside of that, how do we learn that? How do we cultivate acceptance and self-love? And if we don't, what does that do? How does that take form in distress, in suffering? Does that come out as different diagnostic frameworks, as, you know, being seen as depression or anxiety or schizophrenia and potentially be pathologized or medicalized, when actually it's just very understandable responses to trauma.
And I think it is, and I think that if people don't have and this is where you can speak to this because I can't, but I'm not a psychologist, but if people don't have an underlying understanding of what it means to grow up within certain cultures, whether it's about the culture of being Black or Asian or whatever it might be, whether it's about the culture of, you know, of silence, which we've touched on, if there is no understanding from the psychologists or the physiotherapists, you know, whoever they might be, about what that means, then you're already starting on a very different level, aren't you? You're not engaging with me on a level which says, I get you. You're engaging with me on a level that says, professionally, I understand that you should fit into this box, and therefore I'm going to put you in this box. And then how do I get out of the box? What, you know, because what does that mean now? Does that mean now you've said I'm depressed, I am now depressed, and that's it for the rest of my life? I mean, I think this is also part of why a lot of people will not go to a doctor and say, I'm feeling XYZ. Because you worry, you will worry. You know, if you say that, therefore I have this thing, this is going to follow me through the rest of my life.
Right. And I think that it's really important to acknowledge that right now, when we look at our mental health systems, we do have, you know, for example, the clinical psychology profession is 88% white. We have a system across mental health services where we call them, you know, the snowy white peaks, where right at the top of consultants, psychiatrists are white professionals, but if we move down to all of the nursing staff, that's only where we see people of colour. So we have actually in the mental health professions, really we're seeing predominantly white people. And what are the experiences of people of colour? Actually, people of colour at the moment are much more likely to be sectioned, to enter the mental health service through the criminal justice system, to be overdiagnosed with schizophrenia, to receive medication instead of psychotherapy or talking therapies, and fundamentally to be perceived and seen as dangerous. So an emotional expression of distress or rage, which is understandable, is deemed as a sickness. You know, and I think we have to think about how race plays a part in this sense making. And when there has been so much harm done by mental health services, how can we encourage systems to rebuild trust from their side, you know, and also how can we feel safe to seek help? Where can we get that safety, you know?
You know, this is where you come into that whole thing about what does community mean? And can community fulfill that role in a way that is safe and can make a difference? Because I think there are two things. I think that I long for a space where you can be who you are without judgment.
Right.
I'm not sure, and I don't have the clinical experience. I haven't ever had to be diagnosed for anything in that way. I'm not sure that the clinical space is necessarily the ultimate safe space, because it sounds as if there are holes and things that aren't being addressed. There are, there are behaviours which come from a different place and need understanding.
Right.
And this is why I think for instance, a lot of my friends who are going into therapy or who are in therapy specifically ask for Black therapists. They are specifically saying, I need someone who does get me before I even open my mouth. I need to be able to do that. I need to be able to walk into a room and not have to explain who I am. I think we were talking earlier about the reality is we put on a lot of clothing for other people. We walk into a space, your instinct, without even thinking about it, is, how do I make other people feel comfortable?
Right.
What is it I need to do in order for you to feel comfortable? I think we all do that. I don't think that's necessarily just down to a race thing, but I think there is a heightened awareness, if you come from a Black or Asian or minority group, about how do I make you feel comfortable. Yes. Now, can you imagine then going into a psychotherapist or a psychologist? Your first instinct is to do that. Right. So you're already wearing the clothes before you even get through the door. You're not taking things off, you're putting things on. How do I become heard? That's a question that I think we need to explore more. But I also wonder about, is there a role for community in this? Is there a role for being able to go beyond the stereotypes? I always remember, always makes me laugh, my nephew, who is very successful in his own right, but when he was a lot younger was coming to see me, and I didn't know that it was him. And he was wearing a hoodie, and I live in Peckham. So I'm like, so I'm behind him, and I'm like, I wonder who this person is. I mean, it's, because he's wearing a hoodie. Now, come on, I live in Peckham. You'd think, and then it turned out it was him. And I really had to check myself. I was like, you know what? You need to make sure you don't fall into these silos of behavior. And it's a very pervasive thing around us. But how do I engage with you at a level that is about you? Yes. Not about the exterior, not about what you're wearing, not about what you've got on your skin, but about you. And I think that is something practitioners have to really deeply think about.
Hugely. Oof, I think there's so much in that, Jumoke. Thank you for sharing that. I think what it speaks to is, yes, practitioners have a lot of work to do to move away from the assumptions that are fundamentally dehumanizing the people in front of them, And there is a lot of work to be done on that side in terms of the whiteness of the profession and creating and cultivating safety for us to be able to seek help. But I think there is also something for us to reflect on, like you said, in terms of at a community level, about what underpins this ideology that there is something wrong with us individually, that we need to be sent away to the doctor, to go into an individual room to fix something within us, that there's something broken that needs curing in our brain, in our biochemistry. Actually, how can we see our experiences of suffering as shared, that this is something that we all experience. We all experience distress, every single one of us, right?
Yes.
Doesn't necessarily make it an illness, and I think that sense making is an understanding that resonates for some people. But is there another way that we can process and use language to describe our distress that enables belonging between us? That means that we can turn to each other more and be with each other and support each other more than only sending people away to therapists, only sending people away to professionals or to take medicine. That actually, how can we be better equipped to sit with each other's distress and suffering, however that looks like,
I mean, I think it's interesting because a lot of what you're describing there is learnt behavior. A lot of the things where I think there would have been a time where, for instance, my mother, who could have potentially been going through distress she wouldn't have gone to a psychotherapist anyway. She wouldn't have gone to any of those. She'd have just sat down with somebody and gone, my life, and even if it's not really a sort of cogent description of what's going on, she's talking about her pain to someone, and they get it, So I think we've lost that in a way. I think we have become so anglicized that we have lost what it meant to be in community, to really be able to turn to your neighbor and say, can you look after my kids? Or, turn to your neighbor and say, I need help today. I'm not saying that's the be all and end all. I'm just saying that I feel there was a sense of that before, and that we've lost it. But actually, I think that's coming back. I think there is a generation now saying, I'm not going to rely on you to tell me who I am. I'm going to discover it for myself, and I'm hopefully going to also find friends who can also help me. I mean, the idea that people are openly talking about going into therapy, but specifically saying I need a black therapist or an Asian therapist, I think is a really big step. And I think also that the therapy or the whatever therapy society, whatever they might be called, need to start looking at themselves. I mean, I know it's a process. I mean, I know you've been going through it. I know it's a really long process. But how do you make that industry, and I will describe it as an industry, more attractive to people who can facilitate the kind of conversations we're having today?
Definitely. And I think what you're speaking to is that there's room for both of those things to coexist, and they're both incredibly important parts of our healing. Yes, we turn to each other, and maybe there is a bit of a loss in terms of what community looks like and being able to turn to each other. But also there is a time where we want to have safe space and safe therapeutic space that we can trust and feel that we can really be ourselves in, and that will be met with acceptance rather than having to go there and do the work of explaining who we are before we even get to the core of the trauma. But I think one of the things that it comes back to as well is how comfortable we are with being vulnerable. How can we, is it okay to say, I'm really, really struggling? This is what that looks like. This is all of the different ways. Beyond just saying, I have depression or I have anxiety, and I think there is a vulnerability in that too. But going beyond that to say, this is what I'm really carrying at the moment,
I think the coronavirus has really pulled us up, by our bootstraps, whatever the phrase is, and made us actually really think about that again. I think it has forced us to be vulnerable, in a way that maybe before we wouldn't have been, and that it's okay to say, I'm feeling like this, because it's a collective feeling now. It's not just one person in isolation and everybody else is happy. I'm not saying people aren't happy. People are. We all find our ways of, finding contentment. Maybe not happiness, but contentment. But I think we are in an environment now where everybody understands what it feels like to be threatened. By an unknowing. This virus is an unknowing. We don't know, as much as we talk about, we can hear the science, we can hear the politicians, we don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know. Please, God, let it have a good outcome. The reality is, though, that lots of people have lost their lives. And so that the conversations are becoming much more about the individual, about this is where I am. And even when you're doing those Zoom conversations, you're having those conversations that you might not have had before. So it's an odd thing to say, but in a way, it's a good thing for that. Because you don't feel like you're by yourself. Does that make sense to you?
It does. And I think what it really speaks to in me is that the thing that makes it easy that you've highlighted is the collectiveness of it, right? So I'm not on my own. This vulnerability is shared. Everybody's suffering. Right? What I think is interesting about that is if we pull that back from beyond coronavirus to the conversations that we're having about distress, everybody's suffering.
Yes, of course.
This is the thing.
But everybody hasn't had the opportunity to be able to say it because there has been an element of shame in it.
Right.
So, so what we're now saying is, or what it feels like is like it's okay to say, I'm going through this, because people actually understand. Do you know what I mean? Like people are beginning to go, oh, I understand what you're going through. That doesn't necessarily mean that you understand my underlying issues. You may not. But there is a collectiveness, as you rightly point out, that has become quite a good signifier of what it means to be distressed. And therefore, I think that allows us a certain degree of vulnerability.
And I think what you spoke to in terms of the undoing of shame, that allows an openness, is really, really fundamental. That this, as painful as this pandemic has been, has enabled in some ways a different kind of conversation, a different kind of language. That is an undoing of shame around our vulnerability. And what can we learn from this to carry through about our suffering beyond the pandemic and more? You know, is this an opportunity to shift the way that we talk about ourselves, our pain, our distress, to connect more beyond the barrier of shame?
I think there is, but I also want to put a caveat in that social media is playing a really almost vicious role in this, of almost turning this on the head. So on the one hand, we are in an environment, or we're in a situation where we are beginning to understand that we are all the same. You know, we all bleed, we all feel pain, we all go through distress. On the other hand, we also know that we are living through probably one of the most vicious times when it comes to things like social media. And that I personally find distressing. You know, I'm on social media a lot for my job, you know, and I watch how people can genuinely say something almost unthinkingly. You know how you have a conversation with someone, you just, you know, and that's, someone will put it in a tweet and suddenly that goes viral, but for all the wrong reasons. That person is shut down. This whole thing around cancel culture is quite an interesting thing now about, you know, how vicious you know, it can be. And so my worry is that on the one hand, you want to be vulnerable. You want to be able to say, this is where I am. And on the other hand, you worry about what does that mean for you socially. So how do we get that balance right, I think is a big question for me.
It's such an important point, because actually we can talk about modelling vulnerability. And yes, let's all be vulnerable, but are the spaces safe enough to hold that? And I think, you know, call-out culture is a really, really great example of the harm that can be caused in spaces that rely on reduced dichotomies and sense-making of the world into good and bad, you know, right or wrong.
And there's no grey now. I mean, before you could have a grey. Now we don't seem to have grey. Now we just seem to have black and white, as you rightly point out, and that's a worry. Because actually life is grey. Life is full of grey, you know, and what we need to embrace is that notion of the fluidity of what, you know, even with truth, you know, your truth may be one thing, my truth may be another. I cannot cancel your truth. You know, I shouldn't be allowed to cancel your truth any more than you should be allowed to cancel mine. What we need to find is the area between, which allows us to have dialogue, which allows us to say, this is who I am as a human being, which allows us to engage. And what I worry and what my concern is around, where is the engagement? Not that I'm shutting this door because this person has said that, but where is the engagement? And that leads to a healthier mental attitude. You know, the idea of being able to say, I don't necessarily get everything you're about, but I am willing to sit with you and learn just the way you should be able to learn from me. And if there's one outcome from all these conversations, for me would be to be able to do that, to be able to celebrate difference and at the same time say, but this is who I am. Do you know what I mean?
Thank you so much, Jumoke. I'm just mindful of time, and I could just talk to you for ages, honestly.
Me too.
I think also it's a really nice way to end it. Just the grey of life, the muddiness in between. That we're just trying to figure out the complexity of it all.
I mean, I think for me, I think we need to accept who we are. I mean, I think the journey begins with us individually. I mean, you touched on earlier on about that whole thing about, is there a space where I can bring all of me, the multiplicity of me, into that space? I think we need to start with, who am I? What am I? and learn the self-acceptance first. And that's hard work. That is hard work. You know, we're not all shiny, bright baubles. We come with all sorts of neuroses and various things that make us who we are. So that, for me, is the first process. And then the next process is, how do I bring myself into the room, honestly, without bringing damage to myself, without doing damage to myself? And then how do I negotiate those spaces? But, you know, it's an ongoing conversation. And, you know, thank goodness for many of us, we will continue to have this journey for the rest of our lives, however long that might be.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. Thank you so much, Jumoke. Thank you. And thank you guys for tuning in. Yeah, please do get involved with the conversation and use the hashtags in the screen below. Yeah, it's just been a real joy talking to you.
Thank you
so much. I'm Sanah Ahsan. I'm a liberation and community psychologist, first and foremost. I'm also a poet and a general all-round disruptor. Done a bit of like broadcasting, journalism, and public speaking. Oof. Yeah, in a lot of ways. I think more broadly, collectively, what we've had to do is face our proximity to death in a way that we haven't had to before. And in that confrontation, I think we've really had to get into what is the meaning of life and like what are the connections we really value when we are like constantly facing death in this way. And I think for me personally, it's really enabled a self-connection. I've been able to spend more time with myself, like go inwards and confront a lot of the difficult feelings that I was avoiding with the busy routine that I was doing before, you know, constantly working, constantly on the move. Being forced to be on my own and be still with all those difficult feelings has actually allowed quite a lot of healing. It's also allowed me to reconnect in a more meaningful and present and compassionate and loving way than I was able to do feeling quite unresourced and moving at the pace that I was before. So there are like benefits that I've reaped, I think, out of this. I think at the same time, you know, it's terrifying. Like what's happening feels incredibly terrifying. Like what felt like a comfortable, to some extent, sense of normality has been completely pulled underneath from underneath us. And like, you know, I've got close loved ones, like my dad is a carer who's working on the front line constantly. I hate to use that language, sorry, I've just reinforced that problematic war language, but yeah. You know, my dad's very much like in the risk work, and I'm feeling very, very nervous about it constantly. It's there, and fearful. So I think, yeah, just like carrying these quite conflicting feelings of fearfulness, the unknown, anxiety, uncertainty, but also practicing like being with uncertainty in a more compassionate and loving way, and coming in towards myself and towards God, and towards the people that I love. So both of those things. Okay, so I think today is incredibly important. Having conversations which model an alternative way of speaking about our distress and our suffering outside of the frameworks that are somewhat limited, like diagnosis, mental illness, which I know that there will be some of that running through today as well, but also having an alternative which also draws on societal trauma, you know, structural oppression, in understanding why we're feeling the way that we are. Really platforming the voices of young people of colour is incredibly important, and unfortunately that's not happening in our mental health services at the moment. So it's just really exciting that Thrive London have curated this event, which is really, really centering those voices, centering the conversation around race and trauma, which is just really missing from a lot of the dialogue around mental health, you know? So that's why I think it's important. And also creativity, creativity, the medium of creativity as an expression of these things is so, so important. And I think what's often missed is how the arts are so healing. It's such an important part of healing for so many of us. can we start thinking a bit more about the arts on prescription rather than medicine on prescription? You know, for example, and I think this event allows a modelling of that, which is really important.